She was the daughter her own family used as a weapon, sent away like unwanted cargo to a dangerous stranger in the mountains, hoping she would fail, disappear, or simply become someone else's problem. But Elena Whitlock had survived 24 years of being told she was too much, too bold, too inconvenient to love. And the man waiting at the end of that mountain road, he wasn't what anyone expected. Neither was she. This is the story of what happens when cruelty miscalculates and sends exactly the right woman to exactly the right place. If this story already has you leaning in, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning Elena Whitlock was told she was being sent away, her mother was humming. That was the part that stayed with her afterward. Not the words, not even the thin satisfaction curling at the edges of her mother's mouth, but the humming. A cheerful, almost girlish sound drifting through the front parlor of the Whitlock house as Cecilia Whitlock folded her hands in her lap and delivered the news the way someone might announce a pleasant change in weather. "Gideon Hale has come calling," she said. "He's asked to court one of our daughters." Elena was standing near the window, half listening, watching a hawk circle lazily above the cottonwood trees at the edge of the property. She turned. "Which daughter?" The pause before her mother answered was barely a pause at all. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but Elena had spent her entire life learning to read the language of that silence, and she understood it completely before a single word was spoken. "You," her mother said. Then, as if that weren't enough, she added, "He didn't specify." Sight. Ash Hollow sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines, the kind of settlement that had grown up fast and rough in the way frontier towns always did. A general store, a livery, a church with a cracked bell, and enough stubborn families to call it a community. The Whitlocks were among the oldest of those families, and they wore that history like armor. Clifton Whitlock had built his fortune in cattle and land speculation, and he had done it with a combination of genuine industry and a particular talent for paperwork that never quite said what people assumed it said. He was respected, he was prosperous, and he had produced 3 daughters, which he regarded as one of the greater injustices life had dealt him. His oldest, Margaret, was 28 and lovely in the careful, deliberate way of a woman who understood her beauty as currency. She had already refused 2 proposals, both men deemed insufficiently prestigious, and Cecilia defended these decisions with the devotion of a general defending territory. His second daughter, Rose, was 26, softer than her sister, quieter, and absolutely committed to becoming whichever version of herself the room seemed to want. She smiled when Margaret smiled. She frowned when Cecilia frowned. She had no opinions that hadn't been borrowed from someone else first. And then there was Elena, 24 years old, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, with a jaw that set too hard when she was angry, and hands that had spent more time in fence work and livestock care than any of her mother's friends thought appropriate. Elena had grown up in this house like a stone grows in a stream, always present, shaped by pressure, occasionally causing damage to whatever tried to flow around her. She had been 11 years old the first time her father called her a problem. She had been 14 when she understood that he meant it permanently. The incident that had sealed her reputation in Ash Hollow had happened 3 years ago in the Central Market on a busy Saturday morning. A man named Hollis Brandt, a creditor who worked for one of her father's business associates, had been dragging a young homesteader named Calvin Pruitt through the square by his collar, shouting accusations about unpaid debts that Calvin's face made plain were either exaggerated or outright fabricated. Calvin was shaking. The crowd was watching with the particular discomfort of people who want to help but have calculated the cost. Elena had been buying flour. She'd set her basket down, walked across the square, and asked Hollis Brandt to show her the paperwork. He told her to mind her own business. She told him that in her experience, men who couldn't produce paperwork for their claims were either incompetent or dishonest, and she was curious which applied here. There had been a scene. There had been words that a woman of her station wasn't supposed to say in public. There had been a moment where Hollis Brandt's face went a particular shade of red that made the people around them take half a step back. And then there had been the paperwork, produced finally with shaking hands, which Elena had read carefully and then pointed out, quietly, in front of a dozen witnesses, contained a calculation error that reduced Calvin Pruitt's supposed debt by more than 60%. Hollis Brandt had left the market without Calvin. Calvin Pruitt had stood there blinking for a long moment, then looked at Elena like she'd done something miraculous. She'd picked up her flower basket and told him to get a different creditor. The story had traveled through Ash Hollow for weeks. Her father hadn't spoken to her at dinner for a month. "You made an enemy of Brandt," he told her finally, when he deigned to address it. "A man we do business with. He was stealing from a homesteader. That is not our affair. I made it our affair." Clifton had looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never been able to fully name, something between fury and a strange, exhausted recognition, like a man staring at a map he'd misread for years and only just now noticing. Then he'd left the room. They had not discussed it again. Gideon Hale's name was known throughout the valley, though few people in Ash Hollow had actually met him. He'd come to this territory 7 or 8 years ago from somewhere east of the Missouri, no one was entirely sure where, and had built his homestead in the upper mountain reach, the kind of terrain that most settlers took one look at and decided was for someone else's ambition. He ran cattle, kept horses, and had apparently constructed most of his operation alone or close to it. The stories about him were the kind that accumulate around solitary men who work hard land without complaint. He was said to be quiet, capable, difficult to read. Someone had once described him as a man who seemed to be waiting for something without being able to say what it was. He was 31 years old. He had come down to Ash Hollow a week ago, Elena learned, come down specifically to speak to Clifton Whitlock, which was unusual enough to be worth noting. He hadn't come about a land deal. He hadn't come about cattle or water rights or any of the practical currencies that brought men to her father's door. He had come, apparently, to ask whether Clifton would permit him to call on one of his daughters. Elena's mother had been delighted. Elena's mother had also, apparently, decided almost immediately that Gideon Hale, a man who lived alone on a mountain and kept his own company and had dirt under his nails, was not good enough for Margaret or Rose. "He's a fine man," Cecilia had said to Margaret privately, though Elena had been in the hallway and her mother's voice carried the way it always did when she thought she was being discreet. "Hard-working. Land is good land, from what I understand, but rough, you know. Very rough around the edges. I don't think it would suit you." Margaret had agreed, because Margaret always agreed with her mother. And so when Elena stood in the parlor and watched her mother fold her hands and say you with that barely there pause, she understood exactly what the calculation had been. They were sending her away. Not because Gideon Hale had asked for her specifically. Not because they believed this was a good match or that she deserved something better than she'd had. They were sending her because she was the daughter they could afford to lose. The inconvenient one, the disruptive one, the one who had spent 24 years refusing to be exactly what this family needed her to be. They thought they were solving a problem. She could see it in her mother's face, the mild, almost charitable expression of someone who believes they are doing a difficult thing for sensible reasons. "We can't send Margaret, she has prospects. We can't send Rose, she'd never manage." But Elena who talks back, Elena who embarrasses us, Elena who treats our business dealings like there's something to be interrogated. Let Gideon Hale deal with Elena. "When?" Elena asked. "He's sending a wagon Thursday morning." "Does he know it's me?" Her mother's expression shifted, just slightly. "He'll know when you arrive." Won't. She spent the 2 days before Thursday in a kind of cold, careful stillness that her family mistook for resignation. She wasn't resigned. She was thinking. She packed what she owned, which wasn't much, 2 good dresses, her working clothes, a pair of books she'd refused to leave behind no matter what, a small folding knife her grandfather had given her when she was 8 years old, and that she'd kept sharpened ever since. She went through the practical inventory of her own skills with the efficiency of a woman cataloging tools. She could ride, she could cook adequately, she could read a contract and spot a bad one, she could manage livestock. She had mended enough fence in her childhood to know the basics, and she did not panic easily. Whether any of that would matter depended on who Gideon Hale actually was. That was the one thing she couldn't calculate in advance. The night before the wagon came, Rose crept into her room and sat on the edge of the bed with an expression that tried very hard to be apologetic. "I'm sorry," Rose said. I know it's not what you would have chosen. It's fine." Elena. "What do you want me to say, Rose?" Rose looked at her hands. They think it'll be hard up there, in the mountains. It probably will be. You don't seem frightened. Elena folded the second dress and set it in the bag. I've been frightened plenty of times. I just don't stop doing things when I am. Rose was quiet for a moment. Do you think he's terrible? I don't know anything about him. People say he's strange, solitary. People say a lot of things. Elena tied the bag closed. People in this town said I was a disgrace. I've been managing on my own assessment for a while now. Rose left shortly after, and Elena sat alone in the dark of her room and permitted Claude's response was interrupted. Herself feel, briefly and without ceremony, everything she hadn't let herself feel in front of her family. The hurt wasn't small. She wouldn't pretend it was. There was something specific and sharp about being handed off like a problem to be relocated. Not sold, exactly, but redistributed. Her own parents, who had watched her grow up in this house, who had eaten at the same table and walked the same floors, had looked at their 3 daughters and decided she was the expendable one, the one whose feelings could be managed later, or not at all. She let herself feel it for a while. Then she put it away. Not because it didn't matter, because she had somewhere to be Thursday morning, and she needed her head clear. The wagon arrived at dawn, driven by a weathered man named Otis, who introduced himself with a single nod and didn't seem interested in conversation, which suited Elena fine. She loaded her own bag without waiting for help. Her father stood on the porch with his arms crossed and said nothing. Her mother stood beside him and said, "Right when you're settled," in the tone of someone who doesn't particularly expect a letter. Rose was the only one who came down the steps. She hugged Elena quickly, fiercely, in a way that felt genuine enough to be almost painful. "Take care of yourself," Rose said. "I always do." Elena climbed up beside Otis and did not look back as the wagon rolled north out of Ash Hollow. She looked forward instead, at the ridgeline rising dark against the pale morning sky, at the road narrowing as the valley fell behind them, at the long, unknowable distance between who she had been in that house and whoever she was going to have to become up here. She was frightened. She was also, underneath that fear, something else, something quieter and harder to name, something that felt, if she was honest with herself, uncomfortably close to relief. The road into the upper mountain reach was not a road so much as an intention. Otis navigated it with the patient competence of a man who had driven this route many times in many kinds of weather and had arrived at a permanent truce with its difficulties. Elena held the side rail and watched the terrain change. The gentle valley scrub giving way to pine and rock, the sky narrowing between ridge lines, the air cooling noticeably as they climbed. By mid-morning, her breath was making small clouds. She hadn't spoken in 2 hours. Neither had Otis, and she appreciated him for it. When the homestead finally came into view, she took it in carefully and without the commentary her mind sometimes supplied. It was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't been able to articulate what she'd expected, until she saw the reality and measured the distance between them. She had half imagined something rough and barely managed. A bachelor's property, functional but neglected, the kind of place that announced its owner's priorities by what it lacked. What she saw instead was a working ranch that someone had clearly thought hard about. The main house was timber and stone, low-roofed against the wind, with a covered porch running the full length of the front. The barn behind it was solid, doors hung true. The fence lines she could see were in good repair. There was a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, not decorative, not pretty, but planted with the practical density of someone who understood winter. A man was splitting wood near the barn. He stopped when the wagon came into the yard and set the axe down and stood there for a moment, and Elena watched him the way she watched most things she was uncertain about, quietly and with her full attention. Gideon Hale was not what the stories had made her picture. The stories had suggested something imposing, and he was tall, yes, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical solidity that came from years of real work rather than intention. But his face, when he crossed the yard and came close enough for her to read it, was not the closed, difficult face she'd prepared herself for. It was a considered face, weathered, patient, the face of a man who had learned to think before he spoke and had decided it was worth the discipline. He stopped at the side of the wagon and looked up at her. "Miss Whitlock?" he said. "Mr. Hale." A pause. She held his gaze and he held hers, and she could see him taking her in the same way she was taking him in, not with the quick, assessing look of a man evaluating a transaction, but with something slower and more careful. "Your family send word ahead?" he asked. "I don't believe so." "No," he said. "They didn't." He said it without particular emotion, but something moved across his expression, gone before she could name it, and she filed that away. He reached up a hand to help her down from the wagon, and she took it, and when her feet hit the ground, she was aware that her whole future had just landed on this dirt with her. "I'll show you the house," Gideon said. The interior of the house was spare without being cold. A main room with a stone fireplace, a long table, shelves of useful things, tools, rope, tin containers of various sizes, a kitchen at the back, a bedroom off the main room that he showed her briefly, telling her it was hers, and that he'd made do with the loft. She almost argued that she wasn't displacing him from his own bed, then stopped herself because she needed to understand more about this man before she decided what to argue about. He put water on for coffee. Good coffee, she noted, not the weak frontier imitation, and they sat at the long table and looked at each other across the grain of the wood. "I want to ask you something," Elena said, "and I'd like an honest answer." "All right." "Did you ask for me specifically?" Gideon wrapped both hands around his tin cup. "No." "I didn't think so. My family sent me because I'm the one they could spare. I think they expected that to be something of a problem for you." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something drier than that. "Is that what they expected?" "I think they may have hoped it, a little." He looked at her for a moment. "Can I ask you something back?" "Yes." "Do you know a man named Calvin Pruitt?" The name was the last thing she'd anticipated hearing, and her reaction was probably visible. A slight stiffening, a flicker of surprise she didn't manage to conceal entirely. "I know who he is. He works his land about 6 miles east of here. Good man. We've traded labor a few times." Gideon set down his cup. 3 years ago he came back from Ash Hollow and told me about a woman who stepped into a market square and called out a creditor in front of a crowd because his paperwork was wrong. Said she read the whole contract standing up in the middle of the street, told Brant what the actual number was, and didn't move until Brant backed down. Elena said nothing. "I was in Ash Hollow that same day," Gideon said, "buying supplies. I saw part of it, but I didn't know who you were. Calvin told me later, said her name was Elena Whitlock, one of the family up on the south end of town." He paused. "I remembered it." "It wasn't anything extraordinary," Elena said. "The math was wrong. Anyone could have seen it. No one else did. People don't like to get involved." "No," Gideon agreed. "They don't." He picked up his cup again. "When I came to Ash Hollow last week and went to your father's house, I didn't know how to ask for you specifically without it sounding odd. I didn't know if you were married or gone, or if I'd even remembered it right after 3 years. I asked to call on one of his daughters and left it at that." He met her eyes. "I didn't know they'd send the wrong one." "The wrong one? The one they didn't want to keep?" Elena looked at him steadily. "I'm not sure there's a right way to respond to that." "You don't have to respond to it. I'm just telling you what's true." She was quiet for a moment. Through the window she could see Otis unhitching the horse, moving with the slow efficiency of a man who had been doing this particular task for 30 years. The mountains beyond the fence line were close here, the timber dark and dense, the sky above them enormous and pale. "I should tell you," she said finally, "that I don't know much about mountain ranching. I can ride. I can manage livestock at a basic level. I'm not helpless, and I'm not fragile, but I don't have experience with this specific kind of land." "That's fine. I'm also—" She paused, choosing the words with care. "I'm not easy to live with. I have opinions, and I say them. I don't manage quietly." Gideon looked at her with an expression she was starting to read as his version of amusement. "I've been living alone for 5 years, Miss Whitlock. I'm used to quiet. I'm not sure I want more of it." The first week was an education in mutual wariness. They were polite to each other in the careful way of two people who understood that they were still mostly strangers, and that the shape of whatever this arrangement was going to become hadn't been determined yet. Gideon showed her the property, the pasture rotation, the water source, the way the wind came down off the north ridge in the afternoon, and what it meant when it shifted. He explained things without condescension, which she noticed and appreciated. He also watched her work, and she knew he was doing it, and she didn't perform for him, just did the things that needed doing as straightforwardly as she could manage. She was slower than she should have been. She knew it, and she didn't pretend otherwise. On the third day, she was repairing a section of fence at the east pasture, and she got it wrong. The post wasn't set deep enough, and she hadn't packed the base sufficiently, and when she tested it, the thing wobbled in a way that was embarrassing. She pulled it out and started over. She was halfway through resetting it when Gideon appeared beside her. He didn't say anything about the first attempt. He crouched down and showed her, wordlessly, how he packed the base. The technique, the amount, the way you tested it as you went rather than at the end. Then he stood up and went back to what he'd been doing. She set the post. It didn't wobble. "Thank you," she called after him. He raised a hand without turning around. That evening over supper, she asked him how he'd learned to manage a place this size alone, and he was quiet for a moment before he answered. Not reluctant, she was learning to distinguish reluctant from considered, and this was the latter. "Made a lot of mistakes at the beginning," he said. "First winter I lost 4 head because I'd read the signs wrong and didn't get them down from the upper pasture in time. Second year the roof on the barn let go in a storm, and I spent 2 days fixing it in the cold, and then got sick for a week after." He looked at his plate. "You figure it out or you don't. Most of figuring it out is just paying attention. Do you miss having someone to talk through problems with?" He looked up at that. "Yes," he said, without hesitation, and the directness of it surprised her a little. "What about the solitude otherwise?" He considered it. "I don't mind solitude. I mind the kind that doesn't have any choice to it." He was quiet a moment. "When you're out here alone, it stops being a preference and starts being just a condition. Like weather." He pushed a piece of potato around his plate. "You can get used to anything. That's not always a good thing." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Now, by the end of the second week, she had developed something close to a routine. And routines, Elena had always found, had a way of making strange situations feel more navigable. She rose early, managed the kitchen garden and the chicken house, and then took on whatever the day required. And the days on a mountain ranch always required something. A fence, a sick animal, a supply run with Otis, the endless maintenance that kept the cold out and the livestock in, and the whole enterprise from slowly returning to wilderness. She was getting stronger. Not dramatically, not in a way she could point to, but she could feel it in small, practical ways. The fence post didn't fight her as hard. The mornings didn't cost her as much. The soreness in her hands was settling into a different kind of toughness. Gideon worked alongside her more than she'd expected. She'd half imagined a division of responsibilities, his domain and hers, divided cleanly, the way she'd seen in homesteads where the man and woman each disappeared into their respective duties and met again at the supper table. But Gideon didn't seem to think in those terms. He worked whatever needed working, and he didn't appear to have a system for which tasks were his and which were hers, which she found both practical and, if she was honest, quietly novel. One afternoon she was in the barn treating a horse's foreleg. The animal had caught itself on something, nothing serious, but it needed cleaning, and the horse was being uncooperative about it. And Gideon came in and, without asking, held the horse's head steady. Not because she'd asked, not making a point of it, just because it was the obvious, helpful thing, and he did it. They worked in silence for a while. The barn was warm with animal heat and the smell of hay, and rain had started outside, soft and steady against the roof. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said, not looking up from the foreleg. "You've been asking me things regularly. Is that a problem?" "No." "Good." She finished cleaning, reached for the cloth. "What made you decide to come to Ash Hollow when you did? After 3 years?" He was quiet for a moment. "Got tired of waiting to decide," he said finally. "I kept thinking, I don't even know this woman. I just saw her do one thing in a market square and heard a story about her afterward. That's not enough to go on." He shifted his hold on the horse's head. "Then one morning last month I got up and thought, but I've been thinking about it for 3 years, which is more than I've thought about most things, which probably means something." She looked up at him across the horse's back. "That's a strange way to make a decision." "I know it." "What did you expect when you got there?" "I didn't know enough to expect anything." And then they sent me. He met her eyes. And then they sent you. The rain came harder for a moment against the roof, and the horse shifted, and they both adjusted without speaking, and Elena was aware of something she didn't quite know what to do with. A small, quiet recognition that this was already different from anything she'd had before, and she wasn't certain yet if different was good or just different. She bandaged the foreleg and stood up. "Thank you," she said, "for holding him." "He's a difficult horse," Gideon said. "Most difficult things are worth managing." She said it without any particular intention behind it, just the way the words came out, and she was already reaching for the supply box when she heard him say, quietly enough that she almost didn't catch it, "Yeah, I'm starting to think so." She didn't respond, but she didn't let herself hide the small, involuntary thing that happened at the corner of her mouth either, because she wasn't in her family's house anymore, and she was done pretending she didn't feel things just to make the room more comfortable. Outside, the rain kept coming down off the mountain in gray, steady sheets, and somewhere in the upper pasture the cattle were moving together the way they did when the weather changed, pressing close against the cold. And neither Elena nor Gideon had said anything yet about what this arrangement was becoming, but the silence between them had shifted into something different than it had been a week ago, and they both knew it, even if neither of them was ready to name it. The silence between them had changed, but neither of them pushed at it. That was something Elena came to understand about Gideon in those early weeks. He didn't rush things. Not decisions, not conversations, not the particular kind of understanding that develops between two people who are still learning the shape of each other. He gave things room to become what they were going to become, and Elena, who had spent her whole life in a house where every silence was either a weapon or a verdict, found that she needed time to trust that quality in him before she could fully appreciate it. She was still waiting for the catch. She knew that about herself and didn't pretend otherwise. There had to be something, some condition buried in this arrangement, some version of Gideon Hale that would eventually surface and confirm what her family had always implied, that she was too difficult, too much, that the problem was always and permanently her. She watched for it with the careful vigilance of a woman who had learned early that pleasant surprises don't announce themselves, but unpleasant ones always find you eventually. What she found instead was a man who argued with her, not cruelly, not dismissively, but with the genuine, slightly stubborn engagement of someone who had his own opinions and wasn't willing to abandon them just because someone else had walked into the room. The first real disagreement came at the end of her third week, over the matter of the north pasture fence. Elena had walked the north fence line on a Tuesday and come back with a clear assessment. 3 sections needed immediate repair before the season turned, and the best approach was to address them all at once. Pull the materials, dedicate 2 full days, finish it properly. She presented this at supper with the practical confidence of someone who had thought it through. Gideon listened. Then he said he thought they should do 1 section at a time, working around the other tasks the week required, because 2 full days away from everything else was more than the ranch could spare right now. "It'll take longer that way," Elena said. "Yes. And if the weather turns before we finish, then we deal with what we can deal with," he said. "I've been managing this fence for 5 years. 2-day pushes have cost me more than a slow approach. That's because you were doing it alone." "I'm aware. With 2 people, it's different math." "Some of it is," he said. "Not all of it." They sat with that for a moment. "You've made up your mind," Elena said. "I have. But I'm not telling you you're wrong about the repair. You read it right. I'm saying the timing's the disagreement." She thought about pushing. She had enough confidence in her assessment to push, but she also recognized something in the way he'd explained himself, not deflecting, not dismissing, just laying out his reasoning and standing behind it, that was different from the arguments she'd had in her family's house, where disagreement was always personal and always a verdict on her worth rather than a difference of opinion. "Fine," she said. "We do it your way. But if we lose a section to weather before we're done, I want that acknowledged." Something moved in his expression. "Agreed." They did it his way. The first section went up solid in a day and a half. The second section, the following week, took a day. The third section they finished on a Thursday afternoon with 2 days to spare before a cold front came down off the north ridge and made fence work miserable. Elena didn't say anything about it, neither did Gideon, but at supper that Thursday he refilled her coffee without asking, which was a small thing and meant nothing probably, except that she noticed it. The fourth week brought Calvin Pruitt. He rode in on a gray horse on a Wednesday morning with a split lip and the careful posture of a man whose ribs were bothering him, and Elena was in the kitchen garden when he came into the yard. She recognized him immediately. Calvin hadn't changed much in 3 years, still the same lean, raw-boned young man, though the youth in his face had taken on more weather. He saw her and stopped his horse. His expression did something complicated. "Miss Whitlock," he said, with the particular tone of a man who has just encountered something he was not prepared for. "Mr. Pruitt." She stood up from the garden row. "You look like you've had a bad few days." "Some." He dismounted slowly, confirming her suspicion about the ribs. "Is Gideon around?" "He's in the upper pasture. He'll be back by midday." She looked at him steadily. "Do you want to tell me what happened, or would you prefer to wait and tell him?" Calvin hesitated. He had the look of a man doing arithmetic about who was likely to be more useful. Then he said, "Brant." Elena felt something go still in her. "Hollis Brant," Calvin said. "He's back. Different papers this time, or papers that look different anyway. He showed up at my property 2 days ago with 2 other men and told me I had until end of month to settle a debt he says my father owed. I've never seen the original agreement and I don't think it exists, but he's got something with signatures on it." He paused. He also had the 2 men do this. He gestured generally at his face and ribs. "Come inside," Elena said. She put water on and Calvin sat at the long table and she looked at his lip, which had scabbed over adequately, and pressed carefully along his left side until he hissed, locating 2 ribs that were either cracked or badly bruised. She wrapped them with the efficient competence of someone who had dealt with livestock injuries often enough that the practical mechanics of physical damage didn't rattle her. "How much is the debt?" she asked. $430. "And the original agreement supposedly belongs to your father?" "My father died 2 years ago. Brant's claiming he kept a private ledger that wasn't part of the estate accounting." "Convenient." "Yes." She handed him a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. "Did he leave you the papers?" "He left a copy." "Do you have it?" Calvin reached inside his coat and produced a folded document, and Elena took it and read it with the same focused attention she'd given Brant's paperwork in the market square 3 years ago. Not skimming, not looking for the obvious problem first, but reading every word in sequence. It took her about 8 minutes. "This is better work than last time," she said. "He had help with it. The language is more careful." She turned to the second page. "But the witness signatures are dated 18 months after your father died, which makes them worthless as evidence for an agreement from 6 years ago." Calvin stared at her. "What?" Line 14. "The agreement is dated 6 years back. The witnesses signed here," she pointed, "and the date on their signatures is from 1.5 years ago. Witnesses have to sign when the agreement is made, not after the fact. This is either an error or fraud. Given that Hollis Brant is involved, I know which I'd bet on." Gideon came in about 20 minutes later, stopped in the doorway, took in Calvin's condition, and Elena at the table with a document in front of her, and asked no questions, just hung up his coat and came to the table and sat down. Calvin explained. Gideon listened. Then Gideon looked at Elena. "What did you find?" She showed him. He read it, slower than her but methodically, and when he got to line 14, his jaw tightened. "We need someone who can make this official," he said. "Write it down with the right language." "There's a land agent in Milford," Elena said, "or a county clerk's office. Either one could review this and put a formal objection in writing." She paused. "But Brant has until end of month. Calvin needs the objection on record before that deadline." "That's 11 days. "I know." Gideon looked at Calvin. "Can you ride tomorrow?" "If I go slow." "Then we go to Milford." Calvin looked between the 2 of them. He stopped. There was something in his face that Elena recognized from the market square 3 years ago, that same slightly stunned expression of a man who had expected to handle something alone and found himself unexpectedly not alone. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Elena said. "Brant needs to stop doing this to people. That's reason enough." They rode to Milford in 3 days, Gideon, Elena, and Calvin at his careful pace, and came back with a formal document from the county clerk's office that laid out in precise legal language every flaw in Brandt's fabricated agreement. The witness date discrepancy was the centerpiece, but the clerk had found two additional problems that Elena had missed, which she noted with the honest acknowledgement of a person who knows when they've been outskilled. "You got the important one," Gideon told her on the road back. "He got the other two. You weren't trained in it. He was. That's not an excuse." "It's not an excuse, it's just a fact." He glanced at her sideways. "You don't have to be the best at everything on the first attempt." "I know that." "Do you?" She didn't answer immediately. The road climbed through a section of heavy pine, the light coming down in long shafts between the trees, and she could hear Calvin behind them talking quietly to his horse, the way a man does when he's in pain and trying to give himself something to focus on. "I know it intellectually," she said finally. Gideon made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's a start. I spent 24 years in a house where being less than completely capable meant being told you were completely worthless. It takes some adjustment." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I imagine it does." They didn't say anything more about it, but Elena was aware that something had passed between them in that exchange, something more direct than anything they'd managed before, a small opening into the actual history of how she'd gotten here and what it had cost her. She hadn't intended to say as much as she had, but it was out now and she didn't regret it, which surprised her somewhat. Obasamasi Matanit. It was the storm that changed everything, and it came on a night in late October with almost no warning. Elena had watched the sky all afternoon with the particular unease of someone who'd learned enough about mountain weather to know that speed and size were different problems, and that the worst weather often moved fast. The clouds had been building to the northwest since noon, and by late afternoon they had taken on a color that made Gideon come out of the barn, look up, and say one quiet word that she'd never heard him use before. "All hands," he said. "Right now." Otis was there. He'd been staying on for the season by then, and the three of them moved through the next 2 hours in a controlled, urgent rhythm. Animals in from the pasture, barn doors braced. The section of roof on the chicken house that had been borderline all season needed more than bracing, and Elena made a fast decision, tore off the compromised section and laid a canvas cover that she tied down with fence wire, in a technique she'd invented approximately as she was doing it, without any certainty it would hold. The storm hit at sundown. It was the kind of storm that doesn't bother with escalation. It arrived at full intensity and stayed there. The wind came off the north ridge in sustained battering waves, not gusts, but walls of moving air that made the barn creak in a way that concerned Elena on a deep structural level. She could hear timber flexing. She could hear the livestock reacting to it. She was in the barn when she heard the upper pasture fence go. She knew the sound, not the crack of a post, but the particular metallic release of wire under tension giving way. A sound that carries even through storm noise if you've spent enough time around fences to know what it means. And she knew what it meant up here. The cattle in the upper pasture could drift through a broken fence line in a storm like this and end up against the tree line by morning, which in this terrain and temperature was a serious risk. She grabbed a lantern and went. Gideon found her 20 minutes later at the break in the fence, already working. He shouted something at her that the wind took away, and she shouted back, and neither of them could hear the words, but they'd been working alongside each other long enough now that words weren't always necessary. He took one end of the wire, she took the other. The repair they managed was not pretty. It was a storm repair, temporary, designed to hold until morning and nothing more. They drove the posts with the hammer going between them because neither of them could sustain the angle alone in the wind. The lantern blew out twice. They worked by the intermittent light of the lightning and by feel. The cattle didn't drift. On the way back down to the house, wet through and cold in the particular deep way that happens when wind gets into everything, Elena stumbled on a rock she couldn't see and went down hard on her knee. It hurt badly enough to make her breath catch, and she sat there for a moment in the dark and the rain. Gideon was beside her before she'd processed that she'd fallen. He didn't ask if she was all right. He'd been in enough situations to know that question doesn't help anyone. He just got his arm under hers and got her back on her feet and kept his hand at her elbow the rest of the way down. Inside, they stood in the main room in the dark. The lamp had blown out, and they hadn't found the matches yet. And breathed. The storm was still going, but the animals were in, and the fence was holding, and the roof was holding, and the canvas on the chicken house was probably still tied because they hadn't heard anything terrible from that direction. "Your knee," Gideon said in the dark. "It's fine." "Elena, it hurts. It's not broken." She found the matches on the shelf by feel and lit the lamp, and the light came up warm and unsteady between them. She looked at him. He was drenched, his hair flattened, mud on his jacket to the elbow, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not relief exactly, something more specific than that, something more personal. "You went up to that fence without telling me," he said. "I knew where it was and I knew what needed doing. You went into a storm on a mountain at night alone. And I was right, and the fence is holding. That's not—" He stopped. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. "I'm not saying you were wrong about the fence. I'm saying that He stopped again. He had the frustrated look of a man trying to locate the right words for something he hadn't expected to feel. "I didn't know where you were for 20 minutes. Elena looked at him. Something in her chest did a slow, complicated thing. "I'm here," she said. "I know." His voice had dropped. "I know you are." They stood there in the lamplight, and Elena was aware that the air in the room had changed the way the air sometimes changes when something has been said that can't be unsaid, or when something that's been quietly growing in the space between two people has finally taken up enough room that it can no longer be ignored. She didn't look away from him, and he didn't look away from her, and neither of them said anything more, because some things are better understood before they're spoken, and this particular understanding was still finding its shape in both of them, raw and unfinished, and more honest than anything Elena Whitlock had been permitted to feel in the house where she grew up. Outside, the storm blew on through the mountain dark, and somewhere in the upper pasture the fence held. The morning after the storm, they didn't talk about what had passed between them in the lamplight. Not because it hadn't happened, Elena was past pretending things hadn't happened simply because they were inconvenient, but because there was too much to do, and the mountain didn't care about unfinished conversations. The upper fence needed a proper repair to replace the storm patch. The chicken house canvas had held, but the underlying roof needed real work now, not later. 2 of the cattle had minor injuries from the chaos of being moved in rough weather. Otis had discovered that the water trough in the south pasture had cracked sometime during the night, possibly from the cold, possibly from debris, and needed replacing before it became a larger problem. They worked through it side by side, the same way they had been working for weeks, except that something had shifted in the texture of it, a kind of quiet awareness that ran underneath the practical work like a current, not disruptive, not even uncomfortable, just present. Elena caught Gideon watching her twice that first day, not checking her work, but watching her the way a person watches something they're still making sense of. She didn't comment on it. She wasn't sure she had the right language for it yet anyway. It was Calvin Pruitt who named it first, because Calvin, for all his quietness, had a habit of saying the plain thing. He came by 4 days after the storm to report that Brandt had received the county clerk's formal objection and had gone silent. No more visits, no more men, no renewed deadline. The debt claim appeared to have dissolved the way fabricated claims do when exposed to documentation, suddenly and completely, with no acknowledgement that it had ever existed. Calvin looked better. The ribs were still giving him trouble, but his face had healed and there was something lighter about him. He stayed for supper, and afterward, when Gideon was outside checking the repaired fence section by lantern light, Calvin sat at the table with his coffee and looked at Elena with the direct simplicity of a man who has no agenda. "You two sorted yourselves out yet?" he asked. Elena looked at him. "That's a fairly personal question." "I know it." He didn't look apologetic. "I've known Gideon 6 years. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. And I've known you about 5 minutes, and I can already tell you're doing the same thing back and just being more careful about it." "I'm not being careful. I'm being practical." "Those aren't different things for you, are they?" She considered arguing and decided against it. He hasn't said anything. He's thinking about how to say it right. That's how he does everything. Calvin turned his cup in his hands. He's not a man who acts before he's sure, but when he's sure, he doesn't waver. He paused. "I'm just saying, if you're waiting for him to be ready, he's close." "I'm not waiting for him," Elena said, which was at least partly true. "Okay, Calvin said in the tone of a man who doesn't believe a word of it, but has the decency not to press. The proposal, if it could be called that, and Elena later thought it was more accurate to call it a reckoning, happened on a Sunday evening 11 days after the storm. The day had been ordinary in the way that mountain days were ordinary now in her experience. Full, physical, requiring her complete attention from dawn through late afternoon. They'd worked the south pasture fence together, a real repair this time with proper materials, and Gideon had shown her a technique for setting corner posts that she'd practiced twice and gotten right on the third attempt, and he'd said, "There," in a tone that wasn't praise exactly, but was something more useful than praise. Simple, factual confirmation that she'd understood something real. They'd eaten supper in the usual companionable quiet. Otis had turned in early. The night outside was cold and clear, the kind of clear that mountain nights get when the temperature drops enough to make the stars look closer than they are. Gideon poured himself a second cup of coffee and sat back down at the table and didn't drink it. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at Elena. "I've been trying to find the right way to say something," he said. She put her cup down. "All right. I haven't found the right way, so I'm just going to say it and you can tell me if I've got it wrong." He met her eyes. "When I came to your father's house, I had an idea in my head of what I was doing, coming to see if the woman I'd thought about for 3 years was real, and if she was, whether there was any basis for an arrangement. Something practical. 2 people who might suit each other." He paused. "That's not what this is anymore." Elena held very still. "I watch you work," he said. "I watch you think through problems. I watch you with Calvin, with Otis, with the animals when you think nobody's looking. I had a conversation with you last month about pasture rotation that I've been thinking about on and off ever since because you said something true that I hadn't seen yet." He stopped. "You went up that mountain in a storm at night because you understood what needed doing, and you did it. And I stood in that room afterward and realized I wasn't relieved because the fence was fixed. I was relieved because you came back." The room was very quiet. "I'm not asking you to honor an arrangement your family made without your full knowledge," Gideon said. "I'm asking you, Elena, if you would be willing to marry me. Not because of any agreement, because I would like to spend my life working alongside someone like you. Because I think you're remarkable, and I haven't said so, and I should have said so sooner." He looked at her steadily. "You can say no. It won't change how this place operates. I'm not using the arrangement as a lever. I want to be clear about that." She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was behaving in a way that was going to take some time to calm down. She was also aware of something much quieter underneath the surface noise, something that had been building since the first week, since the fence post he'd shown her without comment, since the coffee he'd refilled without asking, since the 20 minutes in the storm when he hadn't known where she was. "You're not easy to read," she said. "I know. I wasn't sure for a long time whether what I was observing was what I thought it was." "What did you think it was?" "I thought you might actually see me," she said. "Not as the daughter they didn't want. Not as a problem someone else redistributed. Just me, what I actually am." She paused. "I've been waiting to find out if I was wrong about that." "You're not wrong." "I know that now." She took a breath. "Yes, Gideon, I'll marry you." He didn't move for a moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, not dramatically, not with any performance to it, just a hand placed over a hand with the quiet certainty of a man who had made his decision and wasn't going to second-guess it. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. You're going to be living with my opinions for the foreseeable future." The thing that happened at the corner of his mouth was, finally, unambiguously, a smile. "I'm counting on it. Tut." They were married in the early weeks of November by the county magistrate in Milford, with Otis and Calvin as witnesses, and no ceremony to speak of beyond the words required, which suited them both. Calvin shook Gideon's hand and hugged Elena with the careful consideration of a man whose ribs were still not entirely right, and Otis said "good" with the gravity of a man delivering a considered judgment, and that was sufficient. The weeks that followed were different in ways Elena hadn't fully anticipated. Not dramatically different. The work was the same work. The mornings were the same mornings. But there was something that had settled, some background tension she hadn't fully identified until its absence, as if she'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop for months and had finally understood it wasn't going to. She slept better. She moved through the days with less of the watchful energy she'd carried her whole life, the constant readiness for disappointment that had been her earliest and most durable coping mechanism. She also fought with Gideon more, which surprised her until she realized it was a symptom of the same change. She'd been careful in the early months, not dishonest, but measured, keeping her full opinion on a short leash because she was in an uncertain situation, and uncertain situations had always punished her for taking up too much room. Now she wasn't uncertain anymore, and so she pushed back on things she disagreed with, fully and without apology, and Gideon pushed back on her. And sometimes she was right, and sometimes he was, and sometimes they arrived somewhere neither of them had started. "You disagreed with me about the calving schedule," she told him one evening, after a discussion that had gotten more pointed than either of them had planned. "But you didn't used to say it like that." "Like what?" "Like you were actually annoyed." He thought about it. "Probably because I'm not trying to make a good impression anymore." She looked at him. That's fair. You're doing the same thing." "I know I am." "It's not a problem," he said. "It's just what people are like when they're actually comfortable." She hadn't had enough experience with that to recognize it, was the honest answer. But she didn't say that out loud. The winter deepened and the homestead held, and they developed the particular rhythms of two people who have committed to a shared life and are now in the less romantic but more real work of discovering how that life actually fits together. Which parts are easy and which parts require negotiation, and which parts will probably always be imperfect and have to be managed rather than solved. Us. Spring came with mud and difficulty, the way spring always does in mountain country, and it was mud season. April, nearly 5 months after Elena had arrived, when a rider came up the road from Ash Hollow and stopped at the gate. Elena recognized him before he reached the house. It was a man named Aldous Finch, who worked as a kind of general factotum for her father. Errands, messages, the small logistical work of a household that ran on staff. He was a slight, nervous man in his 50s who had always seemed vaguely apologetic about his own presence in any room. She went to the gate and did not open it. "Miss Whitlock," Aldous said, and then corrected himself. "Mrs. Hale." "Mr. Finch, what is it?" He reached into his coat and produced a letter, and extended it across the gate with the expression of a man delivering news he doesn't endorse but isn't in a position to refuse. She took it and read it. It was from her mother. The letter was 3 pages long, which Elena read twice, which was more than it probably deserved, but she wanted to be sure she had understood the full scope of it before she formed her response. What she gathered, stripped of her mother's elaborate phrasing, was this. A business arrangement of her father's had collapsed, not unexpectedly, Elena thought, given what she knew of how he operated, and in collapsing had taken several related investments with it. There was debt. There were legal complications of the kind that attached themselves to men who had spent years keeping 2 sets of informal understandings. The house in Ash Hollow was potentially at risk. Margaret's marital prospects, which had been dependent in part on the family's standing, had deteriorated correspondingly. The letter asked for help. It didn't quite use that word. It suggested that Elena, having presumably settled happily into her new life, might be in a position to assist her family through a temporary difficulty. It noted that family was family, and that surely Elena understood the importance of standing together in hard times. It did not acknowledge that they had sent her away. It did not acknowledge the year of silence that had followed. It did not acknowledge anything at all about how she had come to be where she was, except as a background condition that made her potential usefulness possible. She folded the letter and looked at Aldous Finch. "Tell me what you know about the extent of it," she said. "Not what's in here. What you've actually seen." Aldous blinked. Then he told her. He was, under the nervousness, a precise and observant man, and his account was more useful than the letter had been. The debt was real and substantial. The legal situation was more complicated than Cecilia's letter suggested. There were several individuals who had claims against Clifton's estate and practice, not just formal creditors. Margaret had indeed lost a serious prospect when the family's financial picture became public. Rose was apparently managing, in Rose's way. She had retreated into her characteristic quiet and was waiting for events to resolve themselves. Is my father aware my mother sent this? Elena asked. He is. He didn't write himself. Aldous paused. I think he found it difficult. That I believe. She thanked Aldous, gave him water for his horse, and sent him back with a message that she would be in contact. Gideon was at the barn when she came back across the yard, and he read the state of her face with the accuracy of a man who had been paying attention for months. From Ash Hollow? He said. My family. She handed him the letter. He read it without rushing, the same way he read anything, and when he finished he folded it on the same creases and held it for a moment. What do you want to do? He asked. Not what do you think we should do, not what's the right thing. What do you want to do? The question aimed precisely at her, at what she actually needed, which was not advice or permission, but someone to confirm that the decision was genuinely hers to make. She thought about it honestly. She thought about her mother humming the morning she'd announced Elena was being sent away. She thought about the silence on that porch, her father with his arms crossed, saying nothing. She thought about the quality of that goodbye and what it had told her about how she had been valued. And she thought about the letter, which in 3 full pages had managed not to say a single word of acknowledgement or regret. I'm not going to let guilt do the work that remorse didn't bother to do, she said. Gideon looked at her steadily. We can help with some of it, she continued, not to rescue them, not to absorb the consequences of my father's choices on his behalf, but there are practical things that can be done to stabilize the situation without eliminating the accountability. She paused. Rose didn't do anything wrong. I want to think about Rose. We can help with Rose, Gideon said, whatever you decide there. I need to go to Ash Hollow. I know. I need you to come with me. He didn't hesitate. Yes. She looked at the letter in his hands for a moment, and then looked at the mountains beyond the fence line, the spring light coming down through the timber, the mud and the green and the long, difficult distance between who she had been when she left that town and who she was standing in this yard right now. And she felt the difference clearly, not as triumph, but as simple, hard-won fact. She took the letter back and put it in her coat pocket. We'll go Thursday, she said. They rode into Ash Hollow on a Thursday morning in late April, and Elena noticed the way the town looked smaller. Not physically. The buildings were where they'd always been. The general store still sitting crooked on its foundation. The cottonwoods along the south road still bare enough from winter that the skies showed through their branches in patches. But the scale of the place had changed in her perception, the way places from your past always change once you've been gone long enough to stop measuring yourself against them. Ash Hollow had felt, for most of her life, like a verdict. Standing in it now, riding beside Gideon with the mud of the mountain road still on their boots, it felt like what it actually was. A small settlement in a valley, neither more nor less significant than the people in it. Gideon said nothing on the approach. He'd said very little on the 2-day ride down, which she appreciated. He understood that she needed to think without also needing to perform her thinking for an audience. What she'd been thinking was this. There are 2 kinds of return. The kind where you come back changed, but pretend you haven't, because the people waiting can't handle the distance between who they expected and who you are now. And the kind where you come back changed, and you don't pretend otherwise, and you let the consequences of that honesty fall where they fall. She had never been good at the first kind. She was not going to attempt it now. The Whitlock house sat at the south end of town, and it was visibly diminished even from the gate. Not ruined, not yet, but the particular quality of a house where maintenance had been deferred, where money had gotten quieter, showed in small accumulated ways. The gate latch was loose. The kitchen garden her mother had kept merely for appearances was untended. One of the shutters on the upper window sat at a slight angle. Elena got down from her horse and tied it at the post and walked up to the front door and knocked. Her mother answered it. Cecilia Whitlock had aged in the way that certain kinds of anxiety age people, not gradually but in visible adjustments, as if the worry had settled into specific places on her face and stayed there. She was still dressed well, still had that upright quality she'd always carried like armor, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there before, something that might have been fear, if Cecilia had been a woman who admitted to fear. She looked at Elena. She looked at Gideon behind her. She said, "You came. with a relief in her voice that she clearly hadn't intended to be audible. "You asked me to," Elena said. "Yes. Yes. Come in." Shad. The interior of the house was the same and not the same. Elena walked through it with the strange double vision that comes from knowing a place too well, seeing both what was there and the memory of what had been there, the furniture that was missing now, the gaps on the walls where her mother had sold pieces quietly, the particular silence of a house that had stopped having staff. Her father was in the front parlor. Clifton Whitlock was 61 years old and had always been a physically substantial man, not tall but solid, the kind of man who took up more space than his dimensions suggested through sheer certainty of presence. That certainty was gone. He sat in his chair like a man who had forgotten why he'd sat down, and when Elena came into the room, he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. It took her a moment to identify it. He was ashamed, not of the debt, or not only of that. She could see it in the way he couldn't quite hold her gaze, the specific discomfort of a man confronting something he'd done that can't be attributed to circumstances or bad luck, but only to himself. "Elena," he said. "Father." Gideon stayed in the doorway, not entering, not absent, simply there, visible, present. She'd asked him to let her lead this, and he was doing that, in the particular way he did everything, completely and without making a performance of it. "I heard you married," her father said. "I did." "The place doing well?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I want to say something, and I want you to let me finish before you respond." She waited. "What we did, how we handled the arrangement with Hale, sending you the way we did." He stopped. He was working at something in his hands, the arm of the chair. "I told myself it was practical, that you were suited to it, to hard circumstances, that it was doing you a favor in a way, getting you out of a situation where you'd never—" He stopped again. "That was a lie I told myself. It was easier than admitting that we treated you as the one we could afford to lose." The room was very quiet. "I'm not asking you to forgive it," he said. "I'm old enough to know that some things don't get forgiven just because someone asks. I just wanted to say it plainly, without the usual dressing on it." Elena looked at her father for a long moment. She thought about the 11-year-old girl he'd first called a problem. She thought about every dinner where her opinions had been received like weather damage, something to be managed and minimized. She thought about the porch and his arms crossed, and the silence that had been its own kind of sentence. She also thought about the man sitting in this chair, who was diminished and frightened and had apparently found it in himself to say something plain for once in his life. "I heard you," she said. "That's enough for now." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't the erasure of anything. But it was what she could honestly offer, and she had decided somewhere on the mountain road down here that she was done offering things she didn't honestly feel just to make rooms more comfortable. Her father nodded. Something went out of him, some held thing, and he looked briefly like a smaller and more human version of himself. Margaret came down from upstairs, and that interaction was harder in different ways. Margaret had no shame to offer. She had something else. A stiff, defensive brightness, the manner of a woman who has decided that acknowledging difficulty is a form of defeat. She greeted Elena with the careful warmth of someone following social protocol, and greeted Gideon with the particular politeness reserved for people one is trying not to visibly evaluate. "You look well," Margaret said to Elena. "I am well." "The mountain suits you." There was something in the way she said it, not cruel exactly, but with the faint implication that mountain life was a suitable destination for Elena's particular type. "It does," Elena agreed, without any defensiveness, because she wasn't defensive about it. "What are you planning to do about your situation?" Margaret blinked. She'd expected small talk, probably, perhaps some navigation of feeling, not a direct question. "We're hoping to manage," Margaret said. "That's not a plan. What specific steps are you taking?" The conversation that followed was uncomfortable and necessary, and Elena drove it with the same practical directness she brought to fence assessments and contract problems. She asked questions and listened to the answers and mapped the actual shape of the problem, which was this. Clifton's debt was real but not catastrophic if approached correctly. The house could be retained if two of the outstanding claims were settled first, which would prevent the kind of cascading legal action that made everything worse. The money for those settlements didn't exist in the family's current liquidity, but it existed, potentially, as a short-term loan against the value of some property on the south end that Clifton still held clear. That's the approach, Elena said. Settle the two priority claims, free up the legal position, then deal with the rest on a manageable timeline. How do you know this? Margaret asked, and her tone wasn't hostile. It was genuinely uncertain. I've been reading contracts and dealing with creditors for the better part of a year, Elena said, and I read well. She felt Gideon, still in the doorway, shift his weight slightly. Not agreement, exactly. Something quieter. The physical equivalent of being known. Rose was the last one she talked to, and the easiest. Rose found her in the kitchen garden in the late afternoon, where Elena had gone to have 20 minutes without anyone requiring something of her. Rose looked the same quietness, same borrowed from the room quality. But she sat down on the garden bench and looked at her sister with something more direct than Elena had seen from her in years. You're different, Rose said. Yes. Good different. I think so. Rose looked at her hands. I'm sorry I didn't, when they decided to send you. I didn't argue against it. I should have. You couldn't have changed it. I didn't try. Elena sat down beside her. Rose, I know. Does that mean you've forgiven me, or that you've just decided not to hold it against me? Probably somewhere between. Elena looked at the untended garden, Rose. When you decide what you want to do, if things here get worse before they get better, there's room on the mountain. That's not an invitation to move in permanently. It's just, you have somewhere, if you need it. Rose looked at her. Her eyes were doing something watery, and she blinked it back, which was the most self-controlled thing Elena had ever seen her sister do. Thank you. Don't thank me. Come visit first. See if you can manage Otis. He'll terrify you. Rose laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, and it was the best thing that had happened in that house all day. They left Ash Hollow the following morning. Elena had arranged, before she left, for a meeting between her father and a land agent she trusted, a man out of Milford who had handled Calvin's situation with honesty and competence. She had written down, on a single page, the sequence of steps she recommended for the debt situation, in order of priority, with the reasoning beside each one. She had left it on the table without ceremony. She had not given them money. She'd thought about it carefully and decided that money given to absorb the consequences of choices her father had made would not help him make better choices. The map was help. The money would have been rescue, and rescue, in her experience, had a way of teaching people that someone else would always arrive. On the road out of town, Gideon rode beside her and didn't speak for a long while. The morning was cool, the kind of clean April cool that smells like everything coming back. How do you feel? He asked eventually. She thought about it honestly. Like I went somewhere I needed to go and said what I needed to say and didn't do anything I'll regret. That's a good outcome. It's not nothing anyway. She watched the road. My father apologized. I didn't expect that. Did it help? A little. Not the way an apology helps when someone doesn't actually owe you anything. More like setting a record straight. Naming what happened out loud. She paused. It doesn't undo it, but I'd rather it was named than have everyone pretend the porch scene never happened. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You know what I kept thinking, sitting in that doorway? What? That those people had 24 years with you and spent most of it trying to make you smaller. He said it without heat, almost conversationally, which somehow made it land harder. And they threw you away and got exactly the outcome they deserved, except they didn't deserve the outcome of you still being willing to come back and help. I didn't come back to help them, Elena said. I came back because leaving things unaddressed bothers me more than addressing them does. And because of Rose. I know. But you still did it. She looked at him sideways. You were in that doorway for a long time. I was paying attention. Were you worried? He considered it. I was ready, he said. Not the same thing. She understood the distinction. Ready meant he'd had his assessment of what the room might require and was positioned to act on it. It didn't mean fear, and it didn't mean certainty. It meant he'd been paying enough attention to be genuinely present. She reached over and put her hand briefly on his arm, and he put his hand over hers for a moment, and then they were both back on their reins because the road required it, and that was enough. The mountain came back into view late the following day, and Elena felt something settle in her chest that she recognized now as the particular feeling of approaching a place that belonged to her. Not the homestead her family had discarded her into, not the destination of an arrangement. Her place, built by her own labor, earned by her own choosing, inhabited by her own genuine life rather than whatever version of herself she'd been performing in Ash Hollow for 24 years. The summer that followed was the best of her life, and she knew it even while it was happening, which was unusual. Usually you only know the best times in retrospect, when they've passed and you're holding their outline. But that summer, Elena could feel it in real time, in the mornings that were difficult, and the work that was hard, and the arguments with Gideon that sometimes lasted days before they found the landing, and in all of it the bedrock fact that she was entirely herself, without apology, in a place where that was not a problem to be managed, but simply the condition of things. Calvin Pruitt came by regularly and brought news from the valley. The word that had traveled down from the mountain, first through Calvin, then through Otis's quiet movement between communities, then through the county clerk who'd handled the Brandt case, was about the woman up on the Hale property who could read a contract better than most men and who had gone into a storm on a mountain to fix a fence and come back with the cattle intact. People in the valley talked about it the way frontier people talk about things that matter, practically, specifically, without embellishment, which is its own kind of respect. A woman from the settlement 3 miles east came by in June to ask Elena to look over a lease agreement her husband was considering. Elena read it, found 2 provisions that would disadvantage the family significantly in the second year, and explained them clearly enough that the woman could explain them to her husband in turn. The lease was renegotiated. In August, a family named Sorensen, recent settlers from the Eastern Territories, came to the door with a situation that was more complicated, a dispute over water rights with a neighboring property that had gotten pointed enough that both families had stopped speaking. Elena spent 2 days on it, reading the original land grants, talking to both parties separately, identifying a solution that divided the seasonal flow in a way that both properties could accept. Neither family was entirely happy with it, which she had learned was usually the sign of a fair outcome. "You're going to be doing this indefinitely," Gideon told her one evening, watching her work through a document at the kitchen table. "Probably. Is that what you want?" She thought about it. "I want to be useful in a way that requires all of what I actually am. This does that." She looked up. "Is it a problem?" "No," he said. "I just want to make sure it's what you want and not what you've defaulted into." She looked at him. That was the question he always asked, she'd come to realize. Not what are you doing, but what do you want, the distinction her family had never once thought to make. "It's what I want," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his own work. Well, a letter came from Rose in September. She was doing better, had found some work in Ash Hollow, helping a woman who ran a small dressmaking operation, which suited her more than Elena would have predicted. The debt situation at the family house was being managed. Clifton had taken the land agent's guidance, and the 2 priority claims had been settled. He was quieter now, Rose wrote. Not defeated, but somehow reduced to a more accurate size, which Elena read between the lines as probably healthier for everyone. Margaret, according to Rose, was still Margaret. She had found a new prospect, a man from the Northern Territory who seemed adequate in the ways Margaret had always measured adequacy. Elena wished her no particular ill. She also had no particular feelings about it, which was its own kind of resolution. She wrote back to Rose and told her the offer stood, there was room on the mountain, and that whenever she wanted to see what the country looked like from higher up, she should come. Rose wrote back within a week with a date in October, and true to it, she arrived on a clear fall morning with 2 bags and an expression of someone who has decided to try something uncertain. She stayed 3 weeks. She was terrible at most of the physical work, which Elena had expected and which Otis confirmed with a single look on the first morning. But she was quietly observant in the way she'd always been quiet. and she understood the household and managed the kitchen with a competence she'd never had the opportunity to show in the Whitlock house, where Cecilia's ownership of that space was total. On her last evening, she sat on the porch and looked at the mountains going dark in the late light and said, "I understand now why you didn't come back." "I didn't come back because I built something," Elena said. "I know, I'm saying I understand it now, seeing it." Rose paused. "She thought she was punishing you, sending you somewhere hard." "I know she did." "She was wrong." "Yes," Elena said, "she was." There are things that cruelty can't calculate. It can locate a vulnerability, the unwanted one, the inconvenient one, the daughter whose difficulty feels like a burden until the burden is gone and you realize it was holding things up. It can find the soft place and press on it. What it can't do is predict what happens when the person it's aimed at simply refuses to break, when they take the thing meant to diminish them and build a life out of it instead, a real one, with real work and real love and real difficulty, and all of it earned. Elena Whitlock had been sent away as a disposal. She had become, instead, something that lasted. She knew that not because the Valley started calling her capable, or because her father had sat in his chair and found 2 sentences of honesty, or because the community had decided she was worth knowing. She knew it because she could feel it in her own bones on an ordinary morning, getting up early, the cold air coming in off the mountain, Gideon already moving in the yard below, coffee on the stove, the long day ahead full of things that needed doing, and a life that was genuinely hers. That was all. That was everything. It was, she had come to believe, exactly enough.